Well, thank you, Vera, for taking the time to chat with me today. I have a lot of questions with you, and we can get going right now. My first question is this: what are the similarities between the COVID-19 pandemic and the Holocaust?
Well, I recognized it right at the beginning uh, in 2020. And that was when we were told, and I live in New York City, which was like an epicenter. And we were told how the hospitals are overwhelmed. They're overwhelmed with COVID cases. And there were a few women, I don't know them or anything, but a couple of women went with their iPhones to hospitals in New York City. They just made the rounds. And guess what? They were empty, totally empty. There were 3 hospitals to which everybody in New York was sent to. Presbyterian on 168th Street. In Brooklyn was a big one. And I don't know if the other one was Bronx or Bellevue. But whatever, those were overwhelmed, yes.
Mhm.
But everything else was on hold, nothing, empty. So I knew it was a fraud. I mean, why are they telling us that all these, thousands of people are bombarding and overwhelming the staff and all of that? Oh, at those 3 hospitals they were, but that was planned. And then I also listened to some Europeans, and it was the same sort of story. The other part, which is that it was, in fact, a murderous operation. The elderly were targeted, not to be treated for whatever, really.
Mhm.
And so immediately I thought, oh my goodness, this is like the T4 program under the Nazis. Under the Nazis, though, it didn't begin with the elderly, it began with babies, with infants and young children under the age of 3. They were medically murdered. And then the older children and the mentally ill, and then finally it was also the nursing homes. Now, these people were regarded as useless eaters. The children and, of course, the mentally ill were disabled. And since the Nazi regime was very much a eugenics oriented regime, and they wanted a perfect genetic race, the Aryan race, so they regarded anyone with a disability as polluting the genetic pool.
Mhm.
Well, today, after the Nazis, eugenics became a dirty word. However, that doesn't mean that eugenics policies were abandoned. On the contrary, in the United States, you have what are called complete lives. This is a protocol for hospitals. This protocol was fashioned by Ezekiel Emanuel, and it's part of Obamacare. And what it does, and this was kind of dusted off, and hospitals were ordered essentially to follow this protocol during COVID.
What was the protocol?
Complete lives.
Complete lives?
Yeah. And what it is, I'll explain to you. It sets a value on human lives. And what they use as the measuring, okay,
Mhm.
is age. Now, adolescents and young adults have the highest value. So they are to get whatever care, no expense regarded, okay? The ones that are the least valuable are, guess what? Babies and the elderly. So there you have it.
Mhm.
That slight variation, but the mindset, the culture and the mindset of public health is the same. You put a value on people's lives and then you act accordingly.
Mhm.
And this was done during COVID in hospitals. They were getting rid of elderly and disabled. There is a lawsuit pending by Scott Shara for his daughter who had Down syndrome, and he has the evidence, I mean, the documents total of how she was murdered. And his one biggest regret is that he took her to the hospital when she had some respiratory problems. But she was otherwise okay. She was nothing wrong with her. But they literally, it's torture to even listen to it. So you can imagine what it was like for him. But this was an eye opener that
Mhm.
this was, in fact, hospital policy, where they well, the ventilators, for example, we were all, oh my God. And Trump went around saying, oh, we've got to have more ventilators, more ventilators. Those were killing machines. Those ventilators were contrary to what people with respiratory illness needed. They weren't, they could breathe, they just couldn't get oxygen in them. Anyway, there were medications, there were alternatives, which doctors were not allowed, they were forbidden. We had a whole list of medicines that had been used for decades, have a long record of both safety and efficacy for all sorts of infectious diseases. And doctors were forbidden. Doctors were, if they used it, they lost their license. So what's that about? That's, in other words, public health was being used as a weapon for murderous operations that's fascism. Um, and the fact that this went through so quickly, that the hospitals accepted these orders from government, that doctors accepted their role as medical murderers, that's pretty frightening. And that's exactly how it went with the Nazis. You know, a lot of those who talk about the Holocaust and Nazis try to make it as though this was totally and completely unique to the Nazis and no one else ever was that bad, or they were they're the only ones that are portrayed as torturers and all that. But hey, this is going on all over. If anything, the Nazi playbook was pretty much adopted in the West by America when they imported scientists and doctors and engineers. These were major Nazi scientists and doctors and engineers, and they were brought to the United States illegally, actually. Truman didn't know about it. He had said nobody who had been in the Nazi party was allowed to come to the United States, except that they just did it anyway. And those who did it, and I read some of the material, it was really chilling to see how these they were a part of the OSS before the CIA. It then wound up being CIA. But they were absolutely, they revered, they had such, they looked at the Nazis, at what they had done, and they admired them. They talked of them as really like opening a whole new highway. And so they brought them to the United States, had scattered them all over the country into medical facilities and scientific facilities and the military. where they continued to do things the Nazi way, the experiments. Um, it's quite a story. I mean, that has come out a bit. There was a book, I forgot her name. Um, but it's the fact is that these people should have all been tried at Nuremberg. So Nuremberg was really just, it was really a show trial of just a very small, tiny segment
Hmm.
of the perpetrators. It really was. And I mean, 23 doctors were put on trial. That's nothing. Germany, there were many, many more doctors. So the point is that really the perpetrators, and there's more than the actual hands-on perpetrators. There are the corporate facilitators, which were never even mentioned at Nuremberg. And those corporate perpetrators are from the United States, the top companies, Rockefeller Foundation. I mean, the, the ones that are still running things, IBM. IBM had a very major role in identifying and cataloging the Jews of Europe so that it facilitated quick locating of Jews in order to send them to death camps. This was IBM right from the get-go. Um,
I think that would surprise a lot of people. And I also want to make mention that when it comes to talking about the Holocaust, you know it intimately. Could you tell our listeners and readers about your story about the Holocaust as well?
sure. I was a child, little child. Actually, I was 3.5. Uh, I was born in Romania, and at 3.5, we were deported. And we were deported to a concentration camp in Ukraine, Mogilev. At that time, it was partly, and one of the problems with Eastern Europe is that the borders change all the time. So what's Ukraine now may have been under another name, but it's people used to joke actually, Jews especially, about the borders. You wake up one in the morning and you're under one flag, and then by the time dinner, you're another flag. So that is not something really new, having a lot of skirmishes there. Um, this was not a death camp, and people need to understand there were more than 42,000 camps, concentration camps, which essentially we were just left to starve. There was nothing, nothing, nothing given at all. And of course, one of the things that Jews were accused of by the Nazis was spreaders of disease. Well, without sanitation, cold, without food, you're going to get all kinds of infectious diseases. Big surprise. And so typhus was rampant in all the ghettos and concentration camps. And my father died of typhus. I'm not really sure when exactly. I don't know. It would have been between half a year at most to a year when we got there. And I was in the camp for 3 years. So I was 6.5 when I left. And I left because my mother got winged. This was in 1944, already at the very end, when it was known that the Nazis were going to totally eliminate those who were still alive in camps and finish them off. So there was some kind of a deal made. In other words, like bartering, where a couple of thousand Jewish children were to be rescued. And eventually, the destination was Palestine. But so my mother lied because this was only orphans. I wasn't technically an orphan, but she lied to save my life. And I had an odyssey for about 8 months where I was alone, really. When we left the camp on the same trains that took the Jews to Auschwitz and to the extermination camps. These were cattle trains. But the difference was that in our case, and we were children, they did let us out once to relieve ourselves. They didn't do that with those going to the death camps. And ingrained in my mind from that journey was one of the children, except she seemed older than the rest of us. Maybe she was 18, 19, anyway, she came back with a baby. She found a baby in the ditch. They wouldn't let her keep the baby, and she wouldn't let go of the baby. So they beat her off the car, and I stared in horror because I knew that they were going to die, that either they'd be shot or just in the elements, cold. It was winter. And I felt guilty because I realized I couldn't do what she did. I understood that somehow this was the right thing to do, to try to save a baby, but I knew I couldn't do it. I wanted to live. So I also felt guilty, by the way, when my father died. I don't know where this moral streak in me at 3.5, and 6 came from, because it wasn't taught. But when my father died, I blamed myself, because en route to the camp, and we went not by train, but by boat across a river. And that boat was, it was like a tub, not quite a rowboat, but a tub. So it was standing room, and it was too overloaded, and we were afraid that it might capsize. So my father took off his winter coat and put into the water. But I held on to my little toy, whatever it was. So when he died, I felt guilty because I thought he died because he didn't have a winter coat. And I was the selfish little girl who kept, her little stuffed toy. So then it was with the baby where I felt guilty. During these 8 months in Romania, they put a false reasoning that the reason we the children were brought back was because we shouldn't have been deported in the first place. I mean, it made no sense, but that was the excuse. That's why they let us back in. Now, I was with a bunch of children. I did not feel, I didn't like being with children. I was an only child, and I was used to adults, and I knew I couldn't take care of myself, and I knew I can't rely on children to take, they bully, and I was a little. So I had to kind of fend for myself. And what I learned during this period is I learned to discern, to choose people who I could trust. And this was very, very important. And I happened to have really chosen very well. Most, I was never abused. I detected, kindness. And, when COVID happened now with the masks, I was beside myself about the children who couldn't see what we look like, what our affect is. And part of that, this we have to understand, everything that's done is done for a purpose. It's not happen chance.
Hmm.
It's done for a specific reason. And part of it was to make children afraid of anybody and everybody. So I really felt very, very strongly about that because looking at person like really, I faced, that's how I judged people.
Right.
So I, at one point, yeah, I was sick, and a man who I think he must have been like part of either Red Cross or something equivalent, where we were in a school, we was given a meal, but I was sitting on the side crying, just whimpering, was very unhappy. And he took me home, and he and his wife nursed me back to health. I was with them about 3 months. And they were Christian, and it was Easter time, and that's also my birthday. And I remember very well they let me play with the Easter eggs, and the East European, Ukrainian ones, and Russian Easter eggs. They're very different from the Western countries, whereas the Westerners use pastel colors, soft. This is different. This is like their embroidery. It's black and red, and the red is X's. So they do the designs that way. So I remember it very, very well. Um, they got in. Now, one of the things that my mother did was she sewed into my coat, into the seams of my coat, every person in whatever location she remembered, so wherever she knew anyone in the world, she put it into my, so that wherever I might land, that maybe I would find somebody who knew us, there aren't many relatives who were out of it, but so I had that, and they found a brother of my mother who was a banker. And in Romania, especially, in some other countries too, but in Romania, if you had money, you could buy your safety, not to be sent. And my father was involved in lumber business, and he had he had money invested in forests. Well, that wasn't liquid money, so he couldn't buy our safety. But my uncle with the bank, it's different. And so they found him, and he sent a chauffeur car for me. But I don't know how that happened, but of course, anything, if Nazis want something, then they get it. So I wound up in this taxi, this limousine, with two Nazi soldiers and the Romanian driver. And I remember very well, I had to play. I had to be a little girl who was visiting my aunt, and now I'm going back to Bucharest, and da. And yeah, I had to do that. I don't know how really, Um, but no, because I spoke both Romanian and German. German was actually my mother tongue. The assimilated Jews in the cities adopted German. That was the that was kind of the lingua franca that used to be French, only during that period it was German.
Mhm.
Uh, so anyway, so that was that. And I got to my uncle, and there it was, practically a palace. So that was kind of, it was hard to make sense of that kind of thing. My mother's brother is there, and they had a son who was 3 years older than me. And I was with them for about 3 months. And then I was headed for Palestine. So, in retrospect, it's like a bundle, package. You're putting it here, you're putting it there, that sort of thing. That's how I. So on the train, in other words, I took a train to the port city where we were taking a boat, Constanza. And I befriended, as I did all along in my journey, is befriend some adults because I knew I couldn't take care of myself. And when we got there were 3 small boats waiting for us. And they read off a list and assigned people to the boats, each one to their boat. And I was supposed to go on the boat with all the children. I absolutely refused. I refused no matter what. They tried to bribe me. That there was nothing. I was not getting on that boat. And, from their point of view, I was like having a temper tantrum, right? Today, that would be oppositional disorder, oppositional defiant disorder. Had fancy names, psychiatry. But at that time, that wasn't sort of, they just tried very hard, but I stood my ground. I sat on my little valise, and no matter what, I wouldn't go. I was all alone. Everybody was already on the boats, and everybody's waiting, and I'm crying there, just wouldn't go. Miraculously, they gave in to me. And I went on the boat with the family that I had befriended. That first night, I was actually knocked out because I get very seasick. So I was really knocked out. I was half asleep or whatever. So I didn't see the horror. I only heard about it the next morning. But a Nazi submarine torpedoed the boat with all the children. There were no survivors. I never said a word, not a word to anyone about it, nothing. But I thought to myself, I was right not to get on that boat. But again, I felt guilty because I was glad to be alive. And the boat, we were headed to Istanbul, Turkey. And from Turkey, we boarded a train to Palestine. Now, what's interesting about that, there's a history to that too, because that line, in other words, the tracks exist, but it's something like only 3 weeks in all its time that a train could actually go from Istanbul, because you go through Syria and Lebanon. And I remember that journey actually because it was all along the Mediterranean Sea, you know. So that's how I got to Palestine. And there again, through my mother's, list of whoever, there she had a sister too. She had a sister who had gone to Israel early on. And so they located her and she came and fetched me. And they had a farm, a family farm, which was just, I was with them also 3 years, 3.5 years. This was my only happy childhood part, those 3 years in Palestine. I mean, they had chickens and ducks and geese and turkeys, and I used to take the turkeys grazing. I was a little shepherdess. When I think about it, this was, and they produced, of course, they sold eggs and they produced milk. There were also about 10 cows and also an orchard with citrus fruit. And there was a fig tree, and we had vegetable garden just for the family, and all that. It was just paradise, you know. And at that time, nobody was rich and nobody was terribly poor. It was a totally different world then in Palestine in 44 until I left. My mother didn't want to join me in Palestine because she realized there would be war and she didn't want to go through another war. So she came to New York. And I left Palestine really on the eve, end of December 47. The war broke out really shortly after. So that was my personal connection to the Holocaust. And what people at first didn't sort of understand, that I remember a lot, but I do. I remember an awful lot of details. I remember being terrified in the camp, especially after my father died, because if my mother died or something happened, there was an orphanage there, and there were skeletons. I used to run and hide whenever I saw them taking them for a walk or something. It was a horror. So I'm constantly lived in fear. And that's, by the way, what everyone in these camps that were not death camps, first of all, they took people, mainly men, for slave labor. Every once in a while, they'd corral them, and some came back, and a lot didn't come back. So, the threat of death was always there, even though there were no gas chambers. It's only a few camps that had that, really. Many, many. Slave labor is something that, again, people sort of don't understand, that was a major, major economy for a lot of the corporations that were involved. Get people to work for nothing, and you don't have to keep them alive. So you see, most of the history is really, sort of cleaned up. It's not because the horror is much, much broader than the extermination camps, because they exterminated mainly those that they realized they couldn't use for work, for labor.
Mhm.
So now at this point in my life, I'm really now part of an endangered species, because many really, they're dying off every hour. So I feel really compelled to exercise my responsibility to the victims who didn't make it. And one of the main things that the victims wanted, because some of them wrote it, they wanted the world to know. They wanted the world to know what happened so that it doesn't happen again. So, but the world didn't want to know. And the world still does not accept the lessons that are there, and they're repeating them.
I want to say that, first of all, I'm so sorry for what you went through. And the second thing I want to talk to you about is this. You talked about lessons. We began this conversation talking about COVID. And the thing that I want to know from you is when we look back at the Holocaust and we think about the amount of evil that was involved, when we look at what happened just recently with the COVID situation, my question to you is, how is it possible for such evil to happen? What is at the heart of all of this?
Number one is the propaganda that instills fear in people. The worst and most powerful weapon is fear. Mm. And you saw what was done with COVID, terror about an invisible virus. Mm. You know, there is a lot of dispute among scientists and doctors about, is there such a thing as a highly infectious, lethal virus? Because the argument against it, and that's mainly biologists, is that a virus that's lethal kills the host. It can't transmit to others. The common cold is very infectious, but it's not lethal. You see,
yes,
there is that argument. And most medical doctors can't, they fight really, sometimes it's pretty bloody in language, I mean, but still they do. And because it's so ingrained in the medical profession, you know, the germ theory and all that. But biologists now are saying, no, this is, you know, someone like Dr. Michael Heaton, who was the Pfizer top scientist, he is saying there's no such thing. There was no virus, nothing, none of that. Mm-hmm. But it's a huge industry that is also invested in it. Think about all the vaccine industry, you know, that's all based on infectious viruses. Bacterial transmission, oh yeah, that spreads. It's not a virus. But anyway, I shouldn't get into that because that's, you know, the experts are fighting with each other. But still, I can have an opinion. It's just what makes sense. So fear was what the lockdowns were about. Mm-hmm. Isolation and fear. And isolation was particularly sadistic. That was, you see, the word, no one used the word sadistic. Now, only a Nazi is sadistic. Oh, no, 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 no. Those who, you know, who issued these orders to essentially keep the elderly locked up alone in their last, year. That's sadistic. To take away children's ability to even learn how to speak. Think about the 1 and 2 year olds. Mm-hmm. They need to see how we form words. They were deprived of that. That's sadism. Because you can't, you don't catch up really. You know, children's development has to be according to their body, their genetic makeup. You can't interrupt it for 3 years and say, oh, well, now you can go back to, it doesn't work that way. So fear was the major thing. And to this day, I mean, there are people who are still terrified of the next virus. The monkey virus, listen, we've had these things before. And again, it's like practice sessions. We've gone through it before, and each time it was nonsense. But it got some people really terrified, and to do anything you say as long as you protect me from the virus. And that fear was really, it was maintained at high pitch because every single media outlet kept on repeating the same thing over. That's how it was maintained.
They had that ticker tape too, showing you how many people had contracted the virus,
Oh,
died.
yeah. And remember what do you call it? The hospital that um, in Maryland. They had that map with the red, the blood, showing you exactly all these pockets of, and how it was growing and getting worse, and where more people dying, more people dying. Well, they weren't dying from COVID. They were dying from if they went near a hospital. The ventilators were killing them, and then remdesivir. I mean, those were all bioweapons. And right now, I mean, you don't know yet the full human casualties from the shots. How is it that the medical profession went along to inject millions of people with what they do not know is in the syringe? That's kept secret under military. This whole Operation Warp Speed, it's under military cover. No disclosure of anything. How do millions, so when you ask about Nuremberg, you see nothing really was learned. The Nuremberg Code was supposed to prevent any such thing. There was no informed consent. I mean, if the doctors themselves do not know what it is they're injecting into people, what kind of consent could the person give? What the deliberately instilled fear does is people are paralyzed and unable to make normal decisions, normal sort of putting two and two together. Mm-hmm. They defer. Only what they're told is what they'll regurgitate. That's how it happens. Once you have a large population completely at your mercy, and you've got big plans, just one of the things after all that happened, and it's all over Western Europe, United States, everywhere, there was a tremendous transfer of wealth. All the little shops, all the local were closed. And guess who benefited the most? Amazon, Google, all the tech companies and the big purchase agents, selling agents, they're the ones that took away all the business. At this point in New York City, I can't find a place to get buttons, to get thread, needle, nothing. Everything has to be through the internet. What this did also, because they wanted us not to communicate with one another, that was terribly important to them as far as lockdown, keep people isolated, locked down, so you can't compare notes, compare thoughts. And they've taken most of that away from everywhere, cities and towns, because the locals couldn't afford to pay rent when they had no customers. So all of that went to the big ones. They made huge. This was extremely profitable for the large interests. So it was a complete transfer of wealth. And it broke up local communication. The less one-on-one relationships that you have, the more, the easier it is to dictate from above. And that's what's happened, really. People listened to the television to get their orders of the day. Governor Andrew Cuomo, whom I called out way back in 2020 as a mass murderer. And I was told, oh, no. He didn't know. I said, excuse me, it's not what I'm saying. It's his words that I'm quoting. When he issued the order to hospitals not to treat the elderly, to send them to nursing homes, he stated, these are his words, not mine, this virus in nursing homes is like fire through dry grass. Before he issued the order, he said that. He then gave immunity, legal immunity, both to hospitals and nursing homes. And he gave the order then. It slaughtered more than 15,000 New Yorkers. Has he been tried? No, he was given an Emmy Award.
Yeah.
And he also made $5 million for a book deal during that time.
I remember.
So you see, that's the reason a Holocaust can happen and is in the works, if we let it, is because there was no accountability. There was no punishment. It was, just a tiny needle in a big haystack.
So, when you're talking about accountability, and here we are in the year 2024, and I think a lot of people want to move on. We just celebrated the memorial of 9/11. I think a lot of people want to move on. Before that, I think about the JFK assassination. A lot of people don't want to talk about that either.
Mm-hmm.
When you, from your vantage point, having lived through these things, do you think people have sufficiently woken up? The majority of people, are they awake to what you're saying? Are they connecting the dots between the most recent atrocity and what we've been talking about, previous atrocities like the Holocaust? Are people sufficiently awake?
No, first of all, I will say this, no, absolutely no, because they haven't really been, as I said, history is sanitized and very much directed to the way those in control want it to be. So, first of all, those who are awake actually were not asleep. And in the United States, the middle of the country, not either sea, not the eastern or western seashore states, but the middle where the farmers are. They didn't buy into it. They didn't wear masks.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember very well when they were pushing the shots. And the reporter, either from CNN or one of them anyway, went down to Texas to a diner. And he started to ask the people if they were going to take the shot. And everyone said no. Finally, the last table he gets to, he's desperate. He needs to show that, he's supposed to show that they're going to do it. He said, well, what about if Donald Trump, at that time he was president, what if he tells you that it's really okay, it's really safe, you should take it? She looked at him and said, who the hell cares what Donald Trump is? I understood what that meant. That told me that no, everything we were told about the Trump people, they're the fascists, they're the, they were just thinking straight. In other words, for some things, they like him. And for this, what do I have to listen to him about? No. And that's been true throughout. I know it also, I live in a big high-rise complex. So we have, all kinds of staff maintenance of various kinds. And I'm here for a very long time, so I guess many of the workers know me, by face. And already a few times I had just a little chat and when I mentioned to one of them, I said, well, at least you don't have to wear masks and all that. He looks at me and says, you mean that hoax? You cannot have an intelligent conversation about this with the educated class, the university influenced class, the PhDs, the MDs. I've got on my floor a neurologist, Columbia University. Well, you know what? He was wearing a mask in March. Now, think about it. This isn't just, a dummy. This is a neurologist. You would think that he would have read how bad masks are for your health. I mean, Dr. Zev Zelenko, who did fight this and, early on and was prescribing hydroxychloroquine and a whole Zumsec, whatever it was, several medications. And he was saving lives. He saved a few thousand lives. And of course, he was hounded and all that. He called masks face diapers. Why would you wear a face diaper? Because in fact, what you're doing is you're breathing out carbon monoxide and anything else that's in your nose, and then you're breathing it back in. Insanity. I even read, they used the same thing in 1918, the so-called Spanish flu that wasn't Spanish and wasn't a flu either. But they used the same thing, the masks. And they had a study in 1918, a hospital, half the staff wore masks and half not. And guess what? No difference.
Mhm.
So the evidence has been there. Even scientific evidence was already there since 1918, but it was a valuable tool of control. Everyone who wore a mask was saying, yes, I'm your slave. I will do whatever you say. That is the message, and that's the purpose.
When we talk about the Holocaust and we talk about COVID-19, not only do I think there's the problem of mass brainwashing, and unfortunately the so-called educated classes more predominantly bought into this. All that's true. But I think the other part of this is a crisis of courage, especially among men. Men who should have known better, men who probably did know better, but were still cowardly. And so I want to ask you this. How do we get people, masses of people, to be braver and to disobey orders that go against their conscience, that go against their integrity?
It's really that's how nature made it, but there's a lot of intervention that's going on. I mean, we're being poisoned in many, many ways. One way is through these vaccines with all that aluminum in them and all sorts of things that are there in order to aggravate your immune system. Your best protection in life is your own immune system.
Mhm.
And what they're doing with all that is bypassing, is trying to prevent the immune system from doing its job. So the way to bring back is essentially to change the education system. It's not, we do not give any education now. It's indoctrination. Indoctrination is what the universities are about. And now even the nursery schools, they have taken over and are confusing little children about their sex. Who the heck allowed that to happen? And it's happening in a really widespread way, coming also from the World Health Organization. So when you talk about the confusion, about men not being men, not assuming their male role, they've been emasculated, both in terms of all little boys have ADHD, so you can give them what do you think the drugs are? Amphetamine. This has been going on now for a long time. This is not new, and they just merely keep on accelerating the number of things that you should not be exposed to and exposing you to it. Fluoride, in Europe, they don't have fluorinated water. We do. Why? It's another little thing that was developed by Nazi scientists. There's a great deal that is going on a massive, scale through the public health, for the sake of public health. That's an abstraction. Doctors are not supposed to treat public health. They're supposed to treat a patient. They're supposed to swear their absolute, I will do no harm to the patient, the one patient, each one at a time, as a human being. Now, what they are instilling is one health formula for everybody. This is both a crime and it's very lucrative. Hey, you don't have to bother with individuality, with different things that different people have, different strengths, different weaknesses, a lot of differences. All that is buried under one size fits all. And who determines what that size is? I mean, even that. Hey, they have eliminated not only the idea of a god, but they claim to be. Yuval Harari has said, we are the gods now. We can hack people. We can this. Really, these are deluded psychopaths. They're deluded psychopaths. They really do believe that they are superior. The Nazis called it Übermenschen.
Yes.
They are. They're completely deluded. They think that they have a right to ruin the atmosphere. All those chemtrails that are spraying all kinds of poison on us. And that they're after one world government. And they've been putting that together now for a long time. And they thought they were ready to take over. It's not quite going their way because there are people who wake up. And let me say this. Anyone who has not taken a COVID shot, I would put my life on it. I'd stake my life on it. None of them are going to take any other shot. Whereas many of those who took the first 3, whatever, are not lining up anymore. So the tide is coming toward awakening. It's not, unfortunately, it's not yet a big tide, but it's slowly. What is interesting is I would say that a turning point, a real line in the sand was drawn when the FDA gave its stamp of okay to give the shot to the 6-month-old babies. That's when the mothers woke up. The mamas said no. And what they've done really is, so now the mothers aren't taking their children for any of the shots because suddenly they realize, why am I doing this? It took that. Those mothers aren't going back. So even if they threaten, yeah, they, can't go to school. This happened with the COVID shots where especially university students, they weren't allowed to come back to school unless they had evidence of the shots. Since when is that? I mean, it's barbaric.
When I hear you say that, it sounds like, to answer this question, how do you get people to be brave, to disobey orders that go against their consciousness? It sounds like it's a function of critical mass. So
Mhm.
when it comes to COVID, when it comes to the lies around the Holocaust, you get enough people to buy into the big lie, and then their friends see what they did and their family members, and it's kind of mass formation psychosis.
Oh, you
But
know, the mass psychosis, I mean, Desmond, I really, you don't have to go into the psychological, really. It's much more straightforward than that because those who are manipulating it are the ones that are doing precisely what has been documented by the what are they called in England, the Institute. Um, got the name, it'll come to me. Um, that's where mind manipulation, mind control has been developed. Okay, since as a matter of fact, there's even evidence that Hitler attended. That's something. He was, yeah, um, something with Stott. God, oh God. Yeah, he, you know, before he was Hitler, he sort of fancied himself to be an artist. So he did a watercolor of him sitting on the bridge, which is at that town where it's at. And they, since the 19th century at least, have been perfecting um, how to get people to do your bidding.
you mean like
Now,
a British version of MK Ultra? Is that what we're talking about?
well, it's much bigger than that. Yeah, it would have been MK Ultra and all that. Yes, it came out of, well, it by then, don't forget, the Nazis also used uh the kind of stuff that MK Ultra actually the Nazis did. In other words, using chemicals, using all kinds of drugs to do it. But the psychological is what Ramstad runs. Oh God, I'll have to look it up. Anyway, uh, the point is, the it was all of that was developed in unison, really, as eugenics in the mid 19th century, and the British intelligentsia were all eugenicists. And Bertrand Russell, interesting enough, who was thought of as the peace lover, yeah. Well, guess what? In 1931, and then he updated it in the 60s, 62 or something, he wrote about education system the way it should be. And it was a two-tier class system. For the elite, you teach one thing, to be creative and all the right things that you think that education should be doing, so they think and they but the rest, keep them busy with games and music, and we will get children to believe that snow is black. Okay, that's pretty. Think about that. Diabolical. Purposely twisting children's thinking into how you dictate they should be thinking.
When you say that, I think of TikTok. I think of video games. I think of social media.
Yeah.
Obviously Bertrand Russell didn't live during the time that we do now, but it seems like these are the outgrowth of what he's talking about.
Yes.
You get kids to focus on things that are immaterial, that are wasting their potential. Is that what you're talking about?
That's exactly what I'm talking about. It's to control them totally. We know our kids will have the great education, everything, but yours will be kept low, kept like a herd. And they've been doing it. They've been doing it.
Mhm.
As I said earlier, there's no education system now. It's an indoctrination system. And you're taught, and you asked about boys especially, because their natural way is more to want more physical when they're little. They're tying them down. They got rid of gym. I used to have to take gym every day, didn't like changing into the, those stupid shorts. But anyway, we had gym, we had to run around a little bit, and now they took that away. And so think of a 10-year-old boy.
Yes.
So that's the way it's truly just as they breed horses. And remember that the eugenics thing, it comes from breeding horses. That's how you breed people. That's what they are getting to.
Is there a way though, like to go back to what we were talking about just a few minutes ago, if you can get people corralled into this unified thinking in a bad way, is it possible to flip that in the sense that as more people wake up
Oh, yeah,
and they expand their consciousness, that grows too into a positive critical mass?
sure. I mean, people who wake up from being in a state of not really being able to uh, think for themselves and just, it's like waking up from a dream, I guess. Um, it's not easy though, I'm sure, because, use it or lose it. There is that. There are things you can't really regain. You can't regain innocence. Um, but what you can do, if you wake up when somebody else puts you to sleep, is you can get very angry then. And you need to let out that anger. Yeah, we need accountability. As long as those who perpetrate this horror on the world, as long as they get away with it, they'll just keep upping the ante. Because for them, there is a difference between them and us. And that difference is that they really, as I said before, they believe that they're entitled to rule over us. And nothing will stop them except we alone. The way they gain their power is by our obedience. If people stopped obeying, they have no power. And we are, 8 billion almost. They are at most 1,000, at most. It's no contest, but we have to assert our right to breathe freely and not to listen to any orders. That's all. Just you've got to get rid of all of the the structures that are now in place. Look, there is no difference between Democrat and Republican. Who in their right mind believes that for these last 4 years, Joe Biden has been president? Okay.
Yeah.
I really would like to, because yeah, and now it'll be Kamala, and now I mean, this is ridiculous. In a country of 350 million, we can't do better, but the system is corrupted right from the top. The whole thing has to be revised.
When I hear you say that there are about 1,000 of them and 8 billion of us, there are those that think that whether we're talking about the Rockefellers or the Rothschilds or
There's,
David,
yeah, dynasties, yeah.
so some people believe that there is really a small elite that
Yeah,
are behind it. What are your thoughts on that?
I absolutely. Look, let me put it this way. When that kind of question comes up, I said, look, in 2020, March 2020, when they declared a pandemic, right? And everybody, all of Western Europe, right? All the Americas marched to exactly the same lockstep. And they had lockstep was actually a Rockefeller Foundation plan in 2010. I mean, they have been rehearsing this thing over and over. This is, yes. And it's written. And when you hear Klaus Schwab from the World Economic Forum speak about what it's going to be like, the new world order, that's not even a unique phrase. It's been used way back for the same kind of thing. New world order where you will own nothing but be happy. Notice, you will own nothing, not we will own nothing. It's very interesting. They actually tell you what they're going to do, what their plan is, but they also know that we are so dumbed down that we won't take action to prevent that from happening. In every which way, everything is written out. The plans are there for anybody to see, to read. But people call it, oh, conspiracy theory, conspiracy theory. I wish it was a theory. They're living through it and they're still calling it a theory.
Along the lines of what you're saying, right now we're experiencing an explosion in technology. You mentioned Yuval Harari earlier. He's a big proponent of technocracy. How does artificial intelligence and the explosion of all this innovation, how does this play into what you're talking about right now?
There again, this is exactly parallel to the Nazis. The Nazis also loved technology, loved innovation for using it as they did. But this was they were way ahead. They had television way before we did. They had all kinds of things, also fancy cars. Technology is, again, it's a tool, but it's been used a great deal as a weapon. It's weaponized. And what AI is, it's a measure of control. Just think about it. They're already telling you what your vocabulary should be. They're dictating it to you. They're getting in the way all the time. You know, now, whether it's on your phone or on your computer, you're constantly being offered what you're trying to say. Who asked them?
Mhm.
They interfere in and guide, push you toward their way. I mean, I know that I have to use all kinds of search engines and stuff, not Google anymore, because it's totally limited.
Mhm.
People don't realize to what degree they're already, yeah, they're slaves in terms of what it is they're allowed to read, what they're allowed to see.
Mhm.
The good news is, and I read a book about, it's called something Valley. Instead of it's about Silicon Valley, but instead he calls it something else. Surveillance Valley.
Mhm.
And one of the things that, of course, you realize again, the internet and all that, that was all CIA. And a lot of the guys who worked on the early technology, while they talked one thing, they were also getting money from the CIA. They were working in concert. The thing about the internet was that the CIA did not want it to be central controlled because they were afraid that their own information would be captured by some central, and they didn't want that. So they left it to be, really decentralized, open. That's the one good thing that we have now. So it means your mainstream media, your mainstream sites, you should stay away from because that's that's the real disinformation. You want real information, go to the alternatives.
Mhm.
And you'll have to dig a little because some are ridiculous, of course, but it's there if you do a little intelligent searching.
Mhm.
So that's what we still have. In China, I gather they don't have that. Lots of places, they do shut off and only allow certain stations, certain sites. to be seen by their people. So, be that as it may, but we have enough still to be able to communicate the truth. And the other thing is that just as the women who took videos of the empty hospitals, we have people taking videos now about all sorts of things that you're not supposed to know about, but it's there. Whether it's huge demonstrations in London on behalf of the Palestinians. You don't hear about it here, but they had 300,000 last week.
I want to talk about the Palestinians in one moment, but you made me think of something else. You know, we were talking about TikTok earlier, and I think about the ways in which culture flourished.
Tavistock, that's what it's called, the
Oh,
institute.
thank you, thank you.
I
I,
told you, yeah.
thank you. I think about the way culture works. So, I grew up, my parents are boomers, and I grew up listening to the wonderful music of the 1960s. And yet, I can't
Beatles,
help
the Beatles.
Beatles, The Doors, Led Zeppelin, and I can't help thinking that there was something more going on than meets the eye. And what I mean by this is right now, the generations that we have don't listen to the same music, they don't watch the same TV shows, they don't talk to each other anymore. Do you think that there could be something more going on in the 1960s beyond the civil rights movement, in the sense that the music that shaped our lives destroyed a monoculture, so that right now we are so siloed that when something like COVID would come along, we cannot unify anymore because our culture is broken?
Absolutely. And I know several musicians who, were shocked to learn that the Beatles and all of that, yeah, they were all groomed and essentially planted to disrupt. If you think about it, even before the same thing with Hollywood, it shaped opinions. That's what it was used for. I didn't know, for example, that Disney was an absolute, Nazi. Um, it was fascist. I mean, and so who knew, But these people essentially were probably recruited, whatever. But if you think even earlier generations, the flapper age or this, all those things were to destroy the culture. And while it was regarded as if it's the thing of the age, no, this is very controlled. That's what it turns out to be. It's really pretty diabolical. They have done this in stages each time, each generation, so that now transgender is normal and you're not allowed to say anything. Think about it. Can you imagine that before? I mean, it's in France now. Everybody, whether they're in the media or school, whatever the language is now, yeah, they have a page of what you're allowed to say, what you're supposed to call people. This is very, very calculated to dehumanize humanity, to make not only pliant, but just to accept, yeah, that snow is black. So morals are, something to throw away because who needs it? You don't want to be shackled with morals or a conscience. What's a conscience? You can't quantify it. It doesn't exist. That's the other thing. Philosophy went that way a long time ago, also in the 60s, right? Positivism. Everything has to be measurable. That's how they got rid of God. And without a spiritual core, whatever it is, it doesn't have to be, going Judaism, Christianity, Muhammad. It doesn't matter what. But if you don't have any kind of sense that there's something more that is not measurable, but it exists. It's part of your human awareness.
Mhm.
That's what makes you moral. You need that in order to, yeah. It's clear. I mean, my husband, who was not a believer, but he used to say, man created God because we need him. We need something to believe in.
If we go zoom out macro for a moment, obviously you have experience with Israel, Palestine, you've experienced with various world events intimately. What are your thoughts about what happened in October, last October, in Israel? What are your thoughts about what's going on in terms of the Israeli war right now? And is there a difference between Judaism and Zionism? How do they all connect? I know that's a big question, but if you could tell me what your thoughts are.
Well, first of all, yes, there's a huge difference between Judaism and Zionism. Zionism was really a discarding of all Jewish traditions, morality, everything. It was it it totally shook Judaism to the core. And it was never accepted by world Jewry. Okay? Not then and not now. Zionism grew at the same time as nationalism in Europe. And nationalism and fascism, communism and socialism, though all of those were formed in the 19th century, as was Zionism. Zionists from the beginning, early on, melded with, collaborated with, and saw them as allies, anti-Semites. Because Zionists, while they discarded all Jewish traditions, religion, God, ethics, all of that was discarded. And the main thrust was to get a nation. They even accepted the Nazi disparaging of Jews as an ethnic foreign entity that doesn't belong in their country. And the Zionists said, yeah, well, we want them to go to Palestine. The world Jews never went. They never regarded the promised land as anything but a spiritual. When the Messiah comes someday, some generation, some century, whatever, it was never a something concrete. So what Zionists did, while they discarded Judaism, they discarded all religion, and as I say, morality, all that didn't matter. They wanted a state, to have our state just like every state. There was a problem. And right from the beginning, they decided how they were going to do it. Number one, they aligned, as I said, with the imperialists, the colonial, because it was a colonial project. There were more than 500,000 Palestinian Arabs when the Balfour Declaration 1917 was issued. It was not a land without people.
For those that don't know, what is that?
Again, Balfour, Lord Balfour, who was a rabid anti-Semite, he wrote on behalf of the British government in 1917 a 67-word letter addressed to Walter Rothschild. It was not addressed to the Jewish people or to government. No, it was addressed to one person. And that promised that the British would help to create a homeland for the Jewish people. And there was the last phrase about, and would not interfere with the religious and civil rights of non-Jews existing there. So they didn't even call them Palestinians, even though they had been living there, forever. When there were more than 500,000 Palestinians, there was like 70,000 Christians, Christian Arabs, and 50,000 Jews. So it's not exactly that this, so instead of trying to negotiate and make, try to create a democratic state, no, they never wanted that. They wanted to get rid of the Arabs right from the beginning. And the British helped they called themselves the Yishuv, the colony. They helped them for quite a few years. But they didn't, instead of, look, they did essentially what they did there is what the United States did to the Indians, which is really to try to get rid of them. That simple. It's a colonial, it is, and it was set up by, Britain. They were the colonial empire ever. The sun never sets on the British Empire, right?
Mhm. And your thoughts about the Israeli war, because this is the outgrowth of all of these policies.
It is. It is totally a continuum. When I, as you know, I'm writing a book, and certain chapters that I'm dealing with about this, it's very, very, very disturbing, because what I find is that Ben-Gurion, who was the first prime minister of Israel, and before that, throughout the 30s and 40s, he was the head of the Jewish Agency, he was the leader. And he was absolutely a fanatic about the state comes first. Everything must be done to protect and to let the state flourish, not the individual, nothing about people, the state. Hey, that's the way nationalists, that's the way fascists operate. It's the state. And this is what we're talking about, the way in which we've been treated during COVID, right? Public health.
Mhm.
What's public health?
Collectivism.
There's no person in there, right? It's just an idea. So he established that because of this great mission that the state has, that the head of state, if there's any disagreement in the government, only the head of state makes the decision. That's exactly what Netanyahu is doing. He's following the exact same. They were totally opposite parties. They were really Ben-Gurion and the early ones until about the 70s. It was all the socialist, supposedly, party that ruled. That was the main one. And then it went to the revisionists, who I remember as a teenager, I used to call them fascist then, it was, but the way in which the government is operating and the way Netanyahu, for example, wanted to undo the Supreme Court that got in his way, that's the Ben-Gurion way. The head of state makes the final decision. There's a dispute. So it's not in any way, they never even considered what democratic give and take, different, equal but different. It never even happened. So it's an apartheid state since forever.
We were to take these ideas that we've been talking about and come back to America. We have an election coming up. Many people believe that we have a two-party system, Democrat, Republican. We talked earlier about Trump, talked a little bit about Biden and Kamala. When it comes to the election here, Do you believe that we have a uniparty that is running this country? Is there a material difference between a Trump presidency and a Kamala presidency?
They take orders. There is really the dark state. Whoever that dark state is comprised of gives the order, and they couldn't care less which one of them. I mean, with one, the language is different. That's all. One uses, politically correct, that's all. It makes no difference. The money and the control comes from elsewhere, and the people have no say in that. I think that both parties have fudged elections for a long time. It's not just one. Rigged elections. And of course, with the machines, behind the scenes, you just change things. I mean, we can edit documents. Well, it's really the same thing.
I think anyone that would listen to this conversation would come away disillusioned. Maybe they would come away hopeful because at least they're getting the truth. And so let me ask you this. We've talked going back to Nuremberg, going back to COVID, we talked about accountability. How do we get accountability for these things? Because I agree with you that if there was accountability, it would halt what's
Mhm.
going on here. How do we get more accountability for all this wrongdoing, all this evil that we've discussed?
Well, within the freedom movement, there's a lot of discussion about that. How do we get people to one of the one of the ways, and unfortunately, that's not something that's in my power because I live in New York City, and so that's totally a lost case because it doesn't matter the party system and all that. It operates throughout. I mean, I don't even know who my council member is or whatever. I mean, it's just really, it's totally. But in localities, in smaller localities, people can exert much more power.
Mhm.
That's the way to do it.
Grassroots.
What?
Grassroots.
Yeah, yeah. Grassroots in various locales. I mean, there are places where, yes, even though, for example, parents associations, there was a whole thing about parents during COVID, and guess what? They were put on the Homeland Security
Oh yeah.
terrorist list.
Mhm.
Just think how far this has gone by now. But all that is illegal according to our Constitution and our Bill of Rights. Everything that they've been doing is illegal. So the holding them accountable, we have the legal means. It's just the will. The will is what's. I wonder, I do not think that American people would like to see a war right now, Third World War, which they're itching to try to explode.
Mhm.
And I took something down because it just happened yesterday. Putin, he just said something. It's very serious. Um, he was asked by the media, and this is yesterday. He was asked by the media about stories that are floating around about the possible deployment of German Taurus cruise missiles into Russia. He said the Ukrainian army is not capable of using cutting edge, high precision, long range systems supplied by the West. This would be qualitative transformation of the war in Ukraine in a NATO war against Russia. This includes, yeah, and he says, in which case Russia has many means to respond to such threats. This includes direct fire on targets within France, the UK, and the US itself. Putin never makes threats. He's giving us a warning. Don't try it because we all know you, the West and the United States, essentially. It's not Ukraine. Now, do you think the American public wants to go to war? I'm positive they don't. I'm positive they don't. They would like, what for? Right, what for? Haven't we had enough deprivation during COVID, right? Now wartime too? No, I mean, it's ridiculous. It would only devastate. So the one thing, the one thing about Trump was that during his term, he didn't start any wars. That's really the one. Who's to say what he would do now? I mean, he's one of the things about him, which is why they really don't want him, is he's unpredictable. You can't control him.
Mhm.
That's really, I think, what they really have against him. I mean, it's like anyone but Trump, anyone but Trump. What does that mean? It's childish.
I have one final question for you. Again, we've talked about some very dark things, but they were at least truthful. What we talked about, it was honest. It was an honest conversation. When you look ahead to future generations, when you look ahead to the short and the long-term future, are you hopeful? What are your thoughts about our future?
It really depends if people wake up. I'm hopeful in the sense that I think that humans have the capacity to heal, but they have to take the step. Each person has to take the step. Each person has to decide for himself, what is important in my life?
Mhm.
And if protecting your family isn't important in your life, then you'll keep on going along to hell, because that's where they're leading you. You have to get off the train. And it's very interesting how, yes, during the Holocaust, those who did jump, and it was very dangerous, but those who did, most of them survived. That's a fact. It was the ones who went and took the orders. They're the ones who perished. And the Zionist leadership did not do what they claim now, as if they had done, great things during the Holocaust to save people. It was quite the opposite. It's a very, very dark history, but it needs to be known. Jews need to know that history so that they're not befuddled, with throwaway, rah-rah phrases and stuff. That's just wrong. That's a way to prevent you from thinking and taking the whole picture. People, the other thing, of course, that's ridiculous, the idea that you have to defer to experts. Hey, most of those experts were wrong in most of their predictions. It's just nonsense.
Yep.
I'd rather listen to the plumber. Said that hoax? That's the point. The beauty is, because, you see, I talked earlier about the protocol for the hospital.
Yes.
The blue collar workers, the craftsmen, they don't have protocols. Each job, they have to make decisions. Each job is different. Whether it's electrical wiring, whatever it is, it's different. He has to make decisions all himself. That's thinking. That means his brain is functioning to make decisions. Whereas doctors who go along really just what you're ordered to. Soon, what they don't realize, what medical doctors don't realize, is that they are on their way out as a profession. And I know what I'm talking about because I was trained to be a librarian, and that's out, doesn't exist anymore.
How so?
How so? Because nurse practitioners can follow the protocol just as well as doctors. And doctors cost a lot more money for the hospital than nurse practitioners. Bingo.
Hmm.
And they won't talk back.
That's very
That's
interesting.
how it happens. Absolutely.
I thought you were
And
going to say AI, but that's That's
Yeah,
very,
and then you have AI telling them what to do, and it's fine. So you don't need doctors. The fact that this neurologist see wears a mask tells you they- they're not thinking at all.
yeah.
Not thinking. It's, I mean, I was astonished, the whole time, yeah, with the mask.
Well, I want to thank you so much for an amazing interview, for all these revelations, and just say how grateful I am. I learned so much from you, and I'm sure my listeners did as well. So thank you very much for your time and for your insights.
Well, thank you. I mean, if I can wake some people up and then they wake up somebody else and it goes on that way, that's the way we have to do it. In the Soviet Union, they got around the censorship with Zamistart, they called it. At that time, it was mimeographed stuff. And just to show you how that really did the trick. People really stopped listening to the government. They stopped reading the regular newspaper. They were all for Zamistan. So there was a joke. A man comes home and his wife is busy typing, typing, typing. At that time it was typing. Remember typewriters? Nobody knows about that now either. Anyways, typing away. What are you typing? War and Peace. Why would you type War and Peace? It's a book. She said, if you want your son to read it, it's got to be in Zamistad. That's the point. You see, wouldn't believe a word that is written officially.
Yes.
That's that's how they eventually threw off those years. It was many years, many more years than Nazism.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. And I want to say thank you again.
Okay, take care.